Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today in Bible study, we did 2 Samuel 11 through chapter 12, verse 24. And this is one of the more infamous passages about David's life. This is the story of David and Bathsheba. So you'll remember on Sunday, one of my highlights that I think is important to remember about David is that he is not a perfect guy. And I bring this up because, again, so often he's just one of these heroes of the Bible that we think we have to believe everything he did was good or that he was unequivocally good, something like that, right? And that's just not the case in his story. Like, David is not always doing the right thing. I think the important thing that the biblical text wants us to take away, though, is the position of David's heart, right? How does he feel about the Lord, and where does he place the Lord in his life, even though he might sometimes not act accordingly in the moment, right? And so the story of David and Bathsheba is a perfect example of this, both in the grievousness of the sin that David commits, but also in the position of his heart when he hears what the Lord has to say and in the face of the Lord's judgment on him. So the story goes like this, right? There's a war going on. David is not with his troops, but he's at the palace, and he sees a woman bathing on top of Ruth, Bathsheba, and she is the wife of one of his kind of elite soldiers, a guy named Uriah the Hittite. And David brings her back and has sex with her, and she conceives. And so David has a problem. How is he going to cover this up? Because it's obviously a wrong thing that he did. So, of course, rather than, bearing some sort of responsibility or, even and facing the shame from that, David instead tries to manipulate the situation. So he tries to get Uriah to go home to his wife. He calls him back from the battlefield and tries to encourage him to go have sex with her. That doesn't work. He gets him drunk, tries to do the same thing. It doesn't work. And finally, David says, well, none of this is working, so I'm just going to have him killed. But of course, you can't just get him killed. So he gets his nephew, Joab, who is kind of a shady guy. He doesn't always play by the rules, so he seems being pretty willing to undertake this roguish task. And basically, he tells him to put Uriah at the front of the line where the battle is going to be the most fierce, hoping that he gets killed. He does, and that's what happens, right? Uriah is killed. And so then after that happens, Bathsheba mourns for 7 days, and then David brings her in to his house as a wife. And that's like that narrative. And she conceives the son that she conceived, she has. And then it ends by saying the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. I think it actually in the Hebrew says was evil in the sight of Yahweh, right? So I think it's actually a little bit stronger than displeased. Like it's seen as a great evil, right? So what happens? Well, the Lord sends Nathan. Nathan is the court prophet to David. And so Nathan goes to David and he tells him a story about a rich man and a poor man, and about, even though this rich man had lots of things, he stole this little lamb that was like a daughter to the poor man from him, and he killed it and ate it, right? And there's a little bit of wordplay in there. Daughter in Hebrew is bat. So when it says the lamb is like a daughter, it's like the lamb is like a bat, and that's the same beginning part of Bathsheba or Bathsheba. So there is a little bit of wordplay there, because you have to remember, David thinks that no one figures this out, right? That's actually, like, it seems as though no one is aware of this. Maybe Joab because of the task, but he thinks that he's gotten away with this. So he responds to Nathan by saying, oh, wow, I would kill the person who did something like that to me, right? Kill that man. And Nathan responds to the famous, you are the man, right? You're the man. Not a very positive biblical affirmation, even though we use it a lot as a positive thing in our life, right? When you say you are the man in the Bible, it's referring to this scene, so not great. And then he brings him a declaration from the Lord, right? And God rebukes David for what he's done, says it's terrible, and he says he brings down judgment, right? He says that the sword is never going to depart from your house, which is true. If you keep reading, David's family is going to fall apart due to kind of civil war and infighting and all these other things, right? And also that David's wives are going to be given to your neighbor. And this is another way of causing strife in David's house. Both of these things are fulfilled in David's own son, who, in an attempt to try and steal the throne from him, will take one of his concubines as a kind of a show of force over his father. And finally, that his son will die. Right, this child that was born out of this this adultery is going to die. Right, but David's not. And this is kind of the first interesting thing that happens. Is we might say, okay, why does this child die and not David? Because clearly the punishment for this deserves death. In fact, that's what this passage implies, right? Well, we aren't really told why, so some of this requires reading in between the lines. There's a few possibilities here. I have them written down just because I thought of them. So the first is that God does do intergenerational punishment. He will punish the families according to kind of previous sins, and so that does happen in the Old Testament. So it's not as though this is unprecedented, but that's a factor that's here. The second is that the death of David would lead to the destruction of the kingdom and a premature end to God's promise. You have to remember that he promised to keep David on the throne, and therefore he has to fulfill that promise to him, right? That covenant, but still needs to punish David for what he's done. Also in the Old Testament, the punishment for an adulterous woman is barrenness, right? And that doesn't really happen here, but you can kind of read that into being a similar fate for Bathsheba, though she does go on to conceive. So not an easy one-to-one there, but just sometimes seen as a kind of an appropriate response to some of these things. But the final thing is when we ask this question, right, because we're focusing kind of on the child. I think the important thing to focus on is how David responds to this. What's David's heart in this whole thing? So David's child falls ill. David is trying to save his son. Obviously, this is a good thing to do, right? So he fasts, he prays, he prostrates himself. People try to get him to eat and stay with them. He won't. After 7 days, the child dies. And they are worried what David is going to do. But what happens is David, when he hears the news that his son is dead, he goes, he washes himself, he anoints himself, he changes his clothes. Basically, he gets himself to look nice. And then he goes into the house of the Lord. This would be the tabernacle. And there he worships. Right? And then he goes home. And when they asked, they set food before him and he ate. And then his servant said, "What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food." He said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, 'Who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live?' But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." So what is David's heart in this whole thing? Well, he honors the Lord in this, right? It's not what he wants to happen, but he accepts that this is the judgment that he is due. And this is really, again, a big part of the thesis statement of Samuel, right? Is the humility. David has the humility to accept the Lord's judgment upon him. And he has the humility to know that this is something he deserves. You'll notice that he doesn't say, "This is undeserved, I don't deserve this," right? He pronounced the judgment himself by saying that whoever did this deserves death. And even though David, should be the one paying for it, instead it's this innocent child who does. And this very much is a mark point where I think that the gospel, you kind of see hints of it here, right? Where an innocent son dies for the sins of the father. Of course, that's not an exact parallel. It's not like God sinned and Jesus has to do that, right? But it's an innocent person dying for the sins of people who are not innocent. And so I think here, right, that this is a good reminder to us of David's heart. And you can even see this in what happens after it, right? So, and this is obviously an important thing. It said, then David comforted his wife Bathsheba. By the way, that's the first time she's referred to David's wife in this whole narrative, even after they're married, or even after they've uh, been together, right? And went into her and lay with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. And the Lord loved him and sent a message by Nathan the prophet. So he called his name Jedediah, because of the Lord. And so Jedediah, right, because of the Lord, or not, that's not what it means. Sorry, it means the Lord loved him. And so even then, right, this is an important turning point because it shows that God's love hasn't turned away, but he's brought his justice. And this is something that David accepts and even recognizes. And so it's obviously very challenging because it's like, okay, when we're going through trials or maybe we're being held accountable or we see things happening, what is our heart posture towards God? Is it as accepting as David's or humble as David's? I don't think so. Right, not mine anyway. And that's where this story can be a real challenge. But it's also a really positive reminder that God cares about justice, even when people who do love him commit it, right? That he's still going to hold them accountable for the evil that they do, which is an important thing to remember. So yeah, that's what we talked about today. I hope you guys found that interesting. I will see you guys tomorrow for an episode of A New Thing, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and peace out.